session. So as I said, what we'll be doing is we had some sort of an orientation as to understand what is landscape, what could be termed as landscape, what is landscape architecture, scope of the subject, and what all it encompasses under its purview. So now we will be looking at the journey of landscape design. Okay, so it's called tracing the journey of landscape design. And why I'm calling it a journey of landscape design is because we are not, I mean, although we will be looking at the historical context, in the historical context, that so we'll be looking at how landscape has evolved. Okay, as a let's say as a profession, as a practice, as uh, you know, uh, uh, as a society, how people have evolved with landscape, and how landscape has evolved with society rather. And we'll trace the evolution of landscape design over the period of time, and hence it's called the journey of landscape design. So these are the broad classifications, or the broad points under which we'll be covering our topics. So it all begins with a virgin planet. Okay. So obviously there was nothing which had any human intervention, or rather we did not have human beings which existed uh, right at the beginning. So we have a virgin planet, and from there we go into an agrarian landscape. That is where people started practicing agriculture for food and sustenance, and the concept of using nature to take shelter for protection comes into the picture. And then we moved on to a much more complex form of man-made landscapes, where people started understanding how to use the natural elements or the natural setting to their advantage. Then we have the impact of geography and society. So as society, by society we mean politics and culture on landscapes. So what are the changes? So how geography, or geographical features or the geographical setting of a particular place affected the people or the settlements, and how did society, when politics or power or culture of a particular civilization, and what kind of effect these things had on landscape design. Then we'll be looking at the historical styles and typologies in landscape. So in certain civilizations, landscape can be classified. I mean, it is possible to classify the landscapes into typologies. So mostly they are the Western European examples from Europe, and which can be classified as typologies. Okay, different styles of landscape. But whereas there are certain civilizations, when it comes to the Indic civilization, or the civilization of India, or if you want to call it Bharatvarsh, where it is really not possible to categorize the types of landscapes into typical typologies. Okay, at least the initial part of it, before the invasions and before the outsiders started coming in. Now, then we'll be looking at the present day worldview of landscape planning and design. Now, this is important because after all this, going through this entire journey of what happened right from day one, where are we today, in terms of the practice or the profession of landscape planning and design. And finally, there would be some questions related to that one could ask about the relationship between architecture and landscape. Is architecture and landscape separate, or is it the same thing? When I say architecture, I'm primarily pointing towards building design, basically. Are they two separate entities, two separate practices altogether, or do they, or do their paths cross each other at some point of time, or are they the same thing, right? And how they are interdependent on each other, if at all they are, is something that we could question and end the session. So I think this entire session, all these topics will be split across 2 sessions. So it is going to be slightly long, so we may overshoot our time by 15-20 minutes, so please bear with me. Right, so initially, as I said, we had as we call it, the earth, Mother Earth and Mother Nature are all around us, and human beings, since the time they have come into existence, they have started they started seeing and perceiving and experiencing the nature around them. So the various natural settings and the natural elements around them. And over a period of time, so obviously it was, initially it was the hunter gatherers, as we may call them. So man was hunting. Okay, so making use of the elements available in the forest, which are conducive for sustenance, in terms of food, in terms of shelter. Then comes the development of technology, okay, to practice agriculture. So when man started understanding that these certain elements from nature, okay, are beneficial to us, and there is a certain way, there is a certain process in which we can probably, multiply these beneficial elements of nature to for the for sustenance, for production of food. Okay, the concept of territory, occupying or securing a certain patch of land and having a connection with that patch of land, because probably that land provides you sustenance in terms of food, in terms of economy. So those kind of concepts, when they started developing, so man started practicing what you can call is the most rudimentary or the most initial form of landscape uh, practice, which is basically called the agrarian landscape. Okay? So landscapes which are associated with farms and food production, basically. So I mean, today it has come to this extent that if you just try to trace the entire journey, so we'll see that we had the virgin nature available, and today in the cities, when we have a look at our cities, so this is what what has happened to that to the entire place. I mean, of course, not every inch of the land on earth, but most of the places are getting urbanized at a very fast pace. So you will see that even in our country, wherever we are building roads, highways, railway networks, and transportation, majorly facilitates growth of cities. So small growth of small towns, then these small towns get industrialized, then these towns, develop into cities, and slowly and steadily, we are losing forest cover. Okay, we are losing all that was the virgin nature which was available to either agriculture. It started with that, and then today it has come to in this world of mechanization, we have come to building fast growing cities. And one could very well imagine that if all we had were cities, then it would be very difficult to imagine the world without uh, our natural landscape. Okay? So without the forests, without the rivers, if everything was to be concretized and everything, all the forest cover was to be taken out and cities were to be built, then probably this would be a doomsday scenario. Like most probably, it's very difficult to imagine that how would we survive without them, because we are still very much dependent on the natural landscape, because the food that we eat is obviously something which comes from nature, right? And that's one of the basic necessities of a life to survive. We may have found an alternative to shelter. We may not be living in caves now. We have buildings, but then as far as our food source is concerned, at least one of the basic things is very much related to our landscape. So the most earliest form is the landscape and the early settlers, and this is a part which is called the cosmic landscapes, and we'll try to understand why this is called cosmic landscapes. So this is the landscapes of the hunter-gatherers and the early settlers. Okay, so these are basically the places, or nowadays these are places of archaeological importance, where we find very strange, a very strange setting. Like you can see in the photographs to the right, uh, where you may find a mound with certain pieces of stones or rocks, boulders arranged in a certain pattern. So early nomadic man perceived cyclic patterns in his world. Now this is very important to understand, because also in the last discussion I was talking about man understanding that nature, the importance of nature, and understanding that we belong to nature. Okay, and that shift and transition to man thinking that nature belongs to us, right, and we possess it, and hence we should do something out of it. And then again, in recent times or in today's times, we're coming back to the realization of the early idea that no, it is basically we belong to nature, and then we need to revere nature, have reverence towards nature, and understand these larger forces of nature, which are not controlled by us. So In earlier days, man perceived these cyclic patterns. Cyclic patterns could be termed as seasons, as what we understand. The summer, winter, rainy. And this is a cyclic pattern, right? And I think even in our Vedic philosophy, we talk about cyclic time. Time is cyclic. Okay, the concept of cyclic time is something which comes from some of these old civilizations, or Vedic civilization being one of them. Whereas the monotheistic cultures believe in linear time, okay, which is not cyclic. But man early on, he understood that there are cyclic patterns. So there are certain cosmological events that happen or that repeat at a certain interval of time, and this affects hunting. This affects food, availability of food. This affects the landscape. This affects the rivers. This affects the forests. Okay, so and this is beyond their control. They cannot control this, and hence from there grows the reverence or respect towards these natural forces. So the natural forces like the sun, the wind, the rivers, the water, the land, okay, the rock forms, the mountains. So all of these are the natural elements, and the natural forces or the cyclic patterns that occur are beyond our control, beyond man's control, and hence the reverence towards it. And then arranging the landscape elements or the natural elements, let's say, in the landscape in a certain way to commemorate those events, okay, or to understand those events, or to capture those events, right? And I think I think we will be looking at that example of Stonehenge, and some other example where we'll see how this happens. One of the earliest examples of any kind of a human intervention are glyphs. So glyphs could be geoglyphs or petroglyphs. Basically, these are huge patterns. I don't know, somewhere maybe, I don't know, in some fiction story, movie, or if someone has had the chance to see this in real, if you've been to Mexico or South America, the Amazon, then I've been told that you can actually see these things in some places. Or if you happen to see some BBC or Nat Geo documentary, you will see that these are these huge patterns, which were made by the early nomadic man on the surface of the earth, either by clearing forests or by making these markings on land, which are called geoglyphs, which would be somewhere larger than 4 meters, or petroglyphs. Petroglyphs would be which are incisions which are made on rocks. So we'll say the Stone Age man used to make these patterns or these images on the rocks. So what these tell us is basically stories about the lifestyle, about the culture, about the beliefs of people in those times. And although these are not directly related to any active use, okay, which we may think that it is not related to any kind of active use, that how could somebody actually use it, you may think of using a park or using a garden in a certain manner. But then this is related to their understanding of nature, their understanding of the cyclic pattern of nature, or their understanding of the forces of nature, and their interpretation of that is what transforms into this kind of an form. So if like Stonehenge, there is there are numerous examples. So one of this is Newgrange in Ireland, where you basically have a huge mound, which is shaped out of the earth, and the orientation of this mound is placed in such a manner that you have the so on the on the winter solstice day, the sun shines through this clerestory window, okay, and the sun rays enters the central chamber and lights up the central chamber, right? So the creation of the mound, a landform, okay, modulating a natural landform, creating an internal chamber, and having some cosmological relevance to it. Okay, so in terms of its orientation, the direction, and so using landform, okay, a landscape form, to suit a cosmological event that happens on one particular day and time of the year. Right? Stonehenge is a very popular example. I think all of you have come across this somewhere in your first year, hopefully. So this is also in England, where this is an so there's an earthen embankment, okay, And of course, and this particular area where you have all these pieces of stones, boulders, which are arranged, okay, and they basically frame the view of the sun, okay, which indicate the sorry, which basically indicate the position of the sun on a particular day of the year, right? So this orientation or this arrangement of the natural features is the most primary surviving, or the most earliest surviving examples of man, or what man would do with landscapes. So I think all these years we have been looking at these examples in terms of history of architecture, okay, and probably this is another way of looking at it, where you say that yes, of course, I mean, it is related to history, no doubt about it, but did we ever look at it as an example of something which is related to landscape, or an intervention in the landscape, in the natural landscape? Because these are, elements which are taken up from the landscape. Whether they belong to this particular place or not is still debatable, because some scholars believe that these stones were not available there. And indeed, actually, because I'd been to this particular site, and for miles on, you don't see anywhere, you don't see any these kind of stones. Okay, so definitely looks alien to this particular landscape, but then they are definitely part of the natural setting here. And of course, I mean, people have always, or more recently, people have started thinking about that. In Britain, if you see in England, or even if you see in Europe, continental Europe, you see that major archaeological sites, you know, are connected, seem to be connected or aligned on an axis, right? And so these are called ley lines, right? And nowadays, we wonder, or the scientists or the historians wonder, that how is it possible that in those days, where people so good in astronomy and and geometry, they could actually figure out and align these, or is it by accident? So this is something which is still people are trying to figure out. And we don't have to go very far, because if you see in India, and if we see the ancient Shiva temples, if you want to take that example, you see that right from starting from Kedarnath to Rameshwaram in Tamil Nadu, all these ancient Shiva temples almost fall on a straight line, on an axis, right? Again, as I was talking about the geoglyphs, the Amazon forest is another example, where when viewed from a height, if you get an aerial view, and you see that in the forests, man has created certain patterns. The meaning of these patterns is always not very clear, and I mean, people and scientists are still researching as to what exactly they mean, or why would they have created these. But the closest that scientists have got, closest to possible reason that people have got to, is they are related to some or the other cosmological event, okay, which happens in the uh, universe. And the reverence to natural forces is something, or a way of connecting the landscape to the natural forces. So even in India, we witness these Neolithic sites, these ancient civilizations, wherever they used to settle, they would often choose or select the site very carefully. So siting of the settlement was very important. So mostly they would go for uh, geological features or geographical locations which are prominent, uh, go for a higher elevation, or place their settlements at a higher altitude. Probably that is for protection and all-round visibility of the surrounding, so that if in case anybody attacks you. So often the siting of these settlements, or siting of these settlements of these civilizations, would majorly depend on the location, or the geographical location of the place, in terms of the latitude, longitude, elevation. So whether the climate is favorable, what are the natural resources available, right? Because at those times, I mean, nowadays we may seem to be less and less depending on natural resources, because it's not that every day we go out and to pluck our own vegetables, or to you know to everybody is not involved in animal husbandry and things like that. But then, yes, certain section of the society is, because we have still not been able to detach ourselves from that, right? But then our lives, in our daily lives, all of us are not equally dependent on nature. But in those days, people were dependent more on nature on a day-to-day basis, and most of the people were. So, so such sites always also used to depend. The location of these sites also used to depend on the on which side of the mountain are they located. So they would pick up a certain preferable site either on the eastern slopes or on the western slopes, and this would change from place to place. So there was no rule book like that always on a hilltop you will be building always on a hilltop, or you will be building in a valley always to the east of the mountain slope. So it's not necessary, because you would look at what is the most favorable geographical condition or climatic condition where it prevails, on which side of the mountain. Okay, it's called the aspect basically. So depending on that, people would select. So landscape, understanding of landscape, understanding of cyclic patterns, understanding of seasons which are affected by landscape has always been a major part of the early settlers or the early man's life. So, I mean, these are some of the ancient civilizations of the world, and Mesoamerica is one of them. We know the Indus River Valley civilization. I don't know if some of you have heard about the Saraswati River Valley civilization. When the Saraswati River has gone extinct, it does not exist any longer. But recent excavations at Rakhagiri, I think in Haryana or Punjab border, they have found out that we had settlements or civilizations older than the Indus Valley civilizations. Okay, so anyways, I mean, these are all new discoveries which are happening, and people are trying to understand that why did the Saraswati River dry up? So was it a geological event? Was it because of the shift? Because was it a geological event, or was it a man-made event? Did we create a situation where the river got extinct? So if you see the Mesoamericans, in Teotihuacan in Mexico, so you will see that there is physical evidence of purposeful urban planning. So just like I think you guys know about the Indus Valley civilization, where in those early days, I mean, this is a example that we have in front of us, where we know that yes, the people in the Indus Valley civilization knew urban planning. I think when we talk about Indus Valley civilization, people often start talking about drainage system. I think drainage would be the last of the would have been the last of the things on their mind. I mean, the knowledge of urban planning, and it is more important to see that they had, or understand that they had knowledge of urban planning. How to plan a city, and drainage is part of it, of course. So even in this case, you will see that they had this knowledge of urban planning. Okay, but in this case, you will see that there is a certain kind of orientation, okay, or alignment of the city, or the main axis, or the main avenues, as they call it, okay, in the direction of a mountain, right? In the direction of a mountain, which is considered as sacred. Okay, and they orient the whole city in that particular direction, in the direction of understanding where the sun rises or from where the moon rises. So depending on these cosmological events, they start orienting their city. Okay, so this is how it basically starts. And of course, there are examples where people have shaped the earth itself, to create settlements, or to create houses, or to take protection from the natural forces. So this is in Kazakhstan, where I was talking about petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are basically these, if you can see this, these are not actually just paintings, but these are basically cut incisions into the rock. Okay, and people would engrave their stories or their cultural beliefs onto these rocks. Okay, I think we will be looking at an example of Bhimbetka, where in Madhya Pradesh, in our country, where we'll be looking at examples of early cave paintings. This is a very interesting example. This is the Bamyan Valley, and these are called the Bamyan Buddhas. Now, I mean, prima facie, looking at this, everybody knows, okay, that I think somewhere during the course of our history discussions last year with your batch, I believe, have told you about this Bamiyan Buddha and what happened to it. But what we are interested to discuss today or understand today is why did this mountain become sacred? Okay, why was this particular mountain, okay, sacred to the Buddhists, that they decided that they should carve these, huge statues of Buddha and create all these, caves like the viharas or whatever we want to call it on the on this particular face of the mountain? The answer is very simple, and the answer is evident from this photograph. If you see the situation over here, and if you see the situation over here, there is a vast difference, right? So the situation over here, if you see the landscape over here, the landscape character of the place over here, so it's all barren, right? So it's like you wouldn't want to go there. You may just, I mean, looking at it, you may think that, okay, I'm just going to maybe die out of thirst, because I don't think anything grows over here, thirst and hunger, because nothing grows over here. There's probably no source of water. And then suddenly we have, this lush green fields and, trees growing here or orchards and whatnot. Suddenly seems like a whole world of difference. So the point is, as I was telling you about the example of the Aravalis, okay, so similarly, these people realized, these ancient people, this was very much part of our Indic civilization, that people realized the importance of these mountains and what they are doing. So if you take the example of Himalayas, okay, we understand why Himalayas is sacred to us, or because ever since you want to call it mythology, you can call it mythology, but ever since Himalayas has been sacred to us, the Indic people, because we understand the importance of Himalayas and what it has done to the geography. Today, most of our country is fertile thanks to Himalayas. Otherwise, it would be we would have been a cold country, perhaps, or at least a major portion of our country would have been a cold country. I'll tell you, I will discuss some other time how the Himalayas came up, what is continental drift, things like that. But let us understand here that the landscape character is so different, and what people understood is this mountain range is protecting this piece of land, which is lush green, where it is possible to do farming, where it is possible to settle down. You can see there are houses here, thanks to this mountain range. And hence they considered these mountain ranges, which is very much part of the natural landscape, as sacred. And they were revered, and hence they had these statues over here. So landscape, initially it was not about, at least at this point of time, it was not about a garden design or things like that. People understood the larger context or the larger repercussions or the larger effect that landscape has on climate, on geography, on topography, on water, on land usability, on places where you can settle and where you can't settle, right? So this is the larger context of landscape, or the understanding of landscape. This example, I think, just in the morning I discussed, that you can see this is an entire mountain, okay, which they had the early settlers, and they decided to have rice farming. So when they wanted to do rice farming, it is not only about farming rice, but as I told you, that each of these terraces, each of these terraces are micro watersheds. So basically they catch water, so the water would flow from one terrace to the other, okay, as it flows down, and they would hold water over here because there is some sort of a bund that they've created over here. If you see these bund walls, and whatever amount of water they want to hold, and then the rest, the excess, would overflow. And also in this particular example, they have these patches of forests, okay. So the patches of forests were preserved, so these were preserved as sacred groves, okay, because what people understood is that these patches of forests have the indigenous, the native plants, which have been here for thousands of years, and which have certain medicine. Some plants would have medicinal value, right? Some plants would have certain commercial value, perhaps, right? Some plants would give you good firewood. So understanding the properties or understanding the importance of these patches of forest, they decided to consider, they considered it as sacred, and hence decided to preserve. So anything, when you start relating it to as sacred, you start preserving it. you don't want to harm it. And that is how this concept of these sacred groves comes into the picture. So this is Philippines, again part of the Indic civilization, because I think we have already discussed this in history, that we ranged from Afghanistan to countries like, Myanmar, Cambodia, Burma, Indonesia. Even we have the Garuda as the national airlines of Indonesia even today. So because that's all because all of these were part of the same culture. And if we talk about India, the old inhabited land. So India is an example where, when we talk about India, and I think this again we have discussed numerous times in our history classes, that when you talk about India in the historical context, you are not necessarily talking about it from the current political boundaries of India, but as a Bharatvarsh as a land, or if you want to call it the Indian subcontinent in the larger context. And like the Western world landscapes were essentially, when we will be looking at the Italian gardens and the French gardens and the English gardens, so you will see that it is very easy to categorize them as English, Italian, French, Japanese, Chinese. But with India, it is not possible to categorize them as typologies. Okay, rather they are more of archetypes. Okay, because like all these ancient civilizations, and the Indic civilization being one of the most ancient civilizations, along with others, of course, uh, people of this land, since times immemorial, have considered landscape as sacred. They have understood this very simple fact, that natural forces are way beyond our control. They control us, in fact. So the geography, the topography, the land, the water of the soil, so this is inherent or indigenous to this place, and we have to find whatever is best suited for us within this natural setting. And they started considering these natural elements or these natural forces as sacred. Okay, and hence we have the physical manifestations of all these natural forces as gods and goddesses. So this idea of getting into the worshipping and things like that, we just started much later. But the basic fundamental idea was that these natural forces are indigenous. So landscape has always been revered in our country. It's always been understood, along with many of these ancient civilizations, that it is sacred to the land. But even when, let's say, the invaders came, whoever came from outside, and they brought certain landscape garden traditions along with them, they also assimilated. Those landscape cultures also assimilated along with us, and today we also recognize them as part of our cultural heritage in terms of landscape, as far as landscape is concerned. So even if we look at the Taj Mahal and we look at the Taj Mahal gardens, okay, or we look at let's say the Humayun Tomb gardens, or the Mughal gardens, or let's say the standalone gardens, or even if you look at the imperial gardens, developed by our colonizers, the Britishers. So let's say Victoria Memorial. So we still consider them to be part of our culture, because that is something which has come to us, and it's on our land today, right? So we have gone through that particular phase in history, and that also assimilated into our culture. But the important part is that traditionally, India has always, or the people of this land have always considered the natural elements to be sacred. And here we have the Mount Kailash. Okay, and when I say the archetypes, how these natural features help to develop or transform into architectural elements or archetypes. Okay, so I think we discussed during uh, the history sessions. Okay, I always keep going back to the history sessions, because some of the things we have already discussed there, that the Mount Kailash is considered sacred, and hence the Mount Kailash is represented in the shikhar of the temple, right? If we talk about the caves, which are very much a part of the natural landform, the natural landscape. So this cave finds a physical manifestation as an archetype in the Garbhagriha. So the ancient sages and sadhus would, we say that they would go into these caves and meditate. Even the Buddhists, monks would go into the caves and meditate. And this is a place for meditation, right? And this has a direct architectural manifestation in terms of physical manifestation in your architectural prototype of a temple in terms of Garbhagriha, right? The Ganges, the river Ganga, okay, or any river for that matter, let's say. I mean, River Ganga is something that we consider as the most sacred because we believe that it flows from Mount Kailash, the head of Shiva, and then comparing comparisons between Shiva and the mountain, and comparing that this comes from the top of the mountain because rivers originating at top of the mountain is considered to be the most sacred because the peak of the mountain considered to be sacred, and hence the River Ganga is considered to be sacred, right? Understanding the rivers are important source of water in our culture, right? What rivers could do, and understanding that rivers can either cultivate your land or it can destroy you. So if you look at the example of Brahmaputra, every few years it changes its course and it can destroy vast expanses of land. So people always used to bow down to these natural forces. So anywhere where there is a river, they are considered sacred. Sites along all sacred sites would be laid down along the river. Why? It is source of water for agriculture, not for consumption. I mean, this is, I think, one of the wrong ideas that many people have, that rivers were sources of drinking water. No, people of this land always knew that river water is not fit for drinking because it is flowing water. Somebody putting up something at the upper higher elevation can pollute something at the lower elevation. So that was not really considered as a very good idea to have your drinking water source in the river. And that's this tradition also continued with the Mughals when they came to India. They also understood this, and they also made use of groundwater, which is the more purer form of water for consumption. So the river water was not for consumption; it was more for agriculture, which people understood the best use for it. And hence we have the development of ghats, the development of the religious places along the ghats where people wanted to commemorate the holiness or the sacredness of the river, right? So ghats would be developed because river is considered as sacred. Today we have the Varanasi Ghat redevelopment project, so an entire landscape development project which is based on the inherent faith of the people, okay, about revering, about having reverence to in a river, right? The sangam of the river would be the one of the most important sites. So it is we believe that whether it is the meeting point of two rivers or the meeting point of three rivers, Triveni Sangam, which becomes important. Nasik is one example, Prayag is one example. So all these places started becoming important religiously because people understood the importance of rivers, what river brings to them life, so hence people started revering them. The Bodhi tree, even if we talk about the Vedic culture, we talk about Buddhism, we talk about Jainism, all of this again, offshoots of the central Indic culture. So the tree, which is a people tree, under which it is believed that Gautam Buddha achieved enlightenment. So it's the people tree is scientifically also named as Ficus religiosa. So there's a religious connection to it. So it is sacred, which within the scientific terminology comes to be termed as that. Now, something very interesting about this ficus species. Okay, ficus is the family basically, and species is the particular species is religiosa, which is people tree. So something interesting about the ficus tree is this banyan tree is also belongs to the family Ficus bengalensis. So ficus family trees, people tree, banyan tree, these trees are called the pioneering species. Now you will be wondering what is great about people tree just because Gautam Buddha sat below it. No, it has much more deep reasons, and there are scientific reasons for it. Ficus trees are or especially the banyan tree and the people tree as well, are called as the pioneer species. What pioneer species means, if you take a barren piece of land today and if you plant a banyan tree, okay, I mean, if you plant several banyan trees, depending on the size of the land, of course, if you plant a ficus species, it starts the microbial activity in the ground. Okay, it changes the pH level of the ground, which is very important for the growth of microorganisms, growth of various bacteria, which helps the growth of various insects, which are very important to for the nutrition of the soil, and it starts making the soil fertile, right? So it has certain properties. The roots of these trees can go very deep, and they're very hardy, so they can penetrate through even hard strata, okay, hard strata of rock below, and they can rejuvenate the soil and start this microbial activity that can fertilize the soil in a way and help other species of plants to grow. Now this is the inherent character of these ficus species, especially the banyan tree and the peepal tree, and hence there is this sacredness attached to them and people revere them. Okay, so it is that I mean, you may have heard that many people say कि हाँ बहुत सारे चीजों का scientific relevance होता है, कुछ चीजों का नहीं भी होता है, और some things the relevance may have changed because of the context of time. Some things may look outdated, but certain indigenous knowledge is still very important. So people still, even landscape architects still today are used this technique where barren lands are transformed into lush green areas, by using this pioneer species. Pioneer is the one that starts the process. So using this pioneer species of ficus, pioneer species called the ficus family trees. So, so we look at the impact of geography and society on landscapes. So, once people and society coming to the picture, then what happened to the landscape? So we will look at this from the point of view of India first, and then go to the world view. So rock shelters of Bhimbetka. So these are the caves. I don't know if someone of you have visited this. Vaibhav sir is from MP. I mean, he was there in MP for quite some time. Maybe he can tell us more about it later. So these are the caves, the rock shelters of Bhimbetka, where even today, if we go there, we find these what we call as prehistoric paintings, cave paintings, right? So it is situated in an area which has dense, thick vegetation. Okay, so this at one point of time, where scientists believe has had this is an area which is rich in natural resources. Okay, in terms of vegetation, in terms of groundwater availability, and people may have selected this site. The early settlers might have selected this site to settle down over here because of the remarkable and the striking resemblance of these rock features, geological features, right? And on these walls, we see the carvings, the paintings, okay, of the life and the culture of the people who used to stay over here. So certain parts of landscape, landscape features, the natural features which have been used as it is for the want of protection. Okay, and also it is not just protection that they are seeking from here, but also they have selected the site, understanding that what all is available, what are the natural resources which are available, because in order to sustain, for the sustenance, long-term sustenance, and also then leaving their imprints. So these caves basically tell us a story today, about their lives. If you see the paintings inside those caves, and of course, so as I spoke about the the civilizations like Teotihuacan in Mexico, we spoke about the civilization. So even in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, I think all of you must have read, that when man started understanding that when there was a shift from living in caves to, they did not directly obviously come to Mohenjo-daro planning. Of course, then man started using even natural elements like branches of trees or tree trunks and animal skins to create protective shelters for them, which were more temporary in nature. And then as the technology must have advanced, and man started understanding that this very soil, on which they are walking, could be used to make bricks, what we know as bricks today, and then construct structures, okay, more permanent structures, and that is how people came up with these cities. And then even when they build these cities, they understood the importance of uh, you know harvesting water. So you will see that probably in areas you will see rainwater harvesting tanks, and then that is where we come to the rainwater harvesting systems and the drainage systems and all those kinds of things. Because whatever said and done, end of the day, rain is going to come, and you need water for sustenance, you need water for agriculture, you need to also drain off the water. So you have to think of hydrology. Okay, you have to think of the siting of the place, selection of the site, where you want to site it. You have to think about the land, you have to think about the topography, you have to think about the hydrology, and then of course you have to also think about the vegetation, or let's say the agrarian landscape in this particular case. And of course the ghats at Ganga at Varanasi. So the ghats are a beautiful way to access the river. So for all the cultural and religious activities that people want to access water, right? And so ghats are a design where you can also get an indication of the level of the river, the rising and falling level of the river. Okay, so that is a temporal character, that is temporary character of the river. It is not, the river does not always stay permanently at one single level. In monsoons it rises, it swells, and in other drier seasons the water level goes down. So, and ghats were also very brilliantly situated. So if you will see that whenever you have a river, so you will have a sinusoidal character. Let's say this is a river, okay, and let's say this is the direction of flow, right? Now you will see that whenever you have in the direction of flow, whenever you have a concave side, okay, whenever you have a concave side, you have a tendency of the soil in this particular side getting eroded in the concave side because of the force of water. So the soil which is over here has a tendency to get eroded. Okay. Now this is what these people understood in those times, not today. And they situated their temples and religious structures in such a manner, in the siting was such that they would always be on this concave side of the river, right? And they would build ghats here. So if you see, this is a bend of the river. So this would be the direction of flow. And they would site, their structures over here on the concave bend of the river, and make ghats over here so that you don't have soil erosion, and you can also access water. Just one simple, very simple intervention of how to stop soil erosion. And of course, this is happening at the important junctions. Maybe it is important. It is happening where you have a Triveni Sangam, or you have the two meeting point of two rivers and things like that. But then it is also important for them to understand that on which bank of the river should we have the temples, and on which bank of the river should we create the ghats. Because this is, we'll discuss when we discuss hydrology, that this is an inherent character of a river. That whenever you have a sinusoidal character of the river in the middle stages, you have this particular thing happening about erosion, and on the convex side you have deposition. So यहाँ से मट्टी निकल के यहाँ deposit हो जाता है ना? So this people understood. So there is a science behind it. There is an engineering science behind this, particularly the location of the ghats, where the ghats are located. Stepwells, another engineering beauty, again to access a natural feature like water, right? And as I said, groundwater has been the primary source of water for consumption for people, the early settlers, the early people in this land. And in India, we have beautiful examples of stepwells all around. And this is also a very good example. Just like the ghats, they understood that if they could access water below the ground, it changes the microclimate, which is, the climatic conditions is much more, the temperature conditions is much more suitable. And especially we'll find these stepwells in Gujarat, some in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. Most of the states being having hot climate and and scarcity of water also. So when the water level, if it rises, okay, you can still access the water at whatever level the water is. And then of course these other chambers and things like that, that that I think we have already discussed as part of history. But what I wanted to make you understand is this: they created a whole structure to access a natural feature like water, and then that changed the character of the space or the way they start using this particular space. And also the engineering technique. I mean, if you have to just imagine that you have to retain all this soil. So they had the engineering capabilities to build an underground tank of this size and of this scale, which is not just a tank, not just a dead tank, but it is also a lively space. Plus, they have the engineering techniques to retain the soil, retain the earth. So definitely, they had the knowledge of geology and hydrology as well, as to where to dig a step well and how to construct a step well. This would not be possible. You cannot construct a step well without understanding the geology of that particular site. Whether you're going to have sandy soil or clayey soil, or whether you're going to hit a hard rock, basalt rock below. Sacred groves, as I was mentioning, certain patches of the forests, in India, which are it's called Devrai. In Maharashtra, we call it as Devrai, I think. So these are spread all across our country. So the basic idea being the same, that this particular patch of forest, where you have all the native species, the native and indigenous species, okay, of trees and plants, having certain value or importance. Now, value or importance is again not always human centric. You may not always question the value in terms of does every tree give has medicinal value? No, there are certain trees which attract certain animals and birds, which are necessary for the sustenance of the survival of the forest itself. So certain animals and birds and reptiles and microorganisms may be attracted by certain kind of vegetation, that is shrubs and trees and plants, which may be necessary for the sustenance or survival of the forest itself, the other species, other plant species of the forest. Okay, because there is an interdependency of the the plants and the animals on each other. So it is not always that anything and everything in a sacred grove is going to be you will be able to exploit something or the other. So exploitation is something that humans we always look at, and that is what has resulted in a negative uh, effect on our natural environment today. So these sacred groves are managed by the local villagers, because the local people understood the importance of these patches of forests. And this is the place where you will also, it is very likely that if you visit a sacred grove, the species of plants and trees that you see over there will give you an idea of the original character of the landscape of that particular place. That each and every tree or each and every plant species would be a species that naturally grows in this particular land. It is nothing which has been brought from Madagascar or brought from Europe or brought from Australia or brought from Africa. Okay, each and every species would be the natural species of that particular place, which will not do any harm. So, like somebody in the morning session said that planting a tree can never be bad. So, if you take the example of the Aravalli mountain, where the Britishers wanted to do afforestation. Okay, now even this is also done by our our municipal bodies these days, or our forest department these days. So what the Britishers did is they started planting a particular species which is locally known as kikar. Okay, kikar ped. So they started planting this on the entire Aravalli entire mountain, and this kikar was brought in from outside India, and this one is an invasive species. Okay, so maybe during some discussion we'll discuss what is invasive species and things like that. But invasive species means this particular tree, when they started planting in large numbers, they started killing all other trees. So every tree that we plant changes the character of the soil, changes the chemical composition of the soil to a certain extent, of course, to a certain extent of area of influence. So it changes the character of the microorganisms that that is supported by the soil. So this started taking over the entire forest. Or अपने आप अब दूसरा species got killed, and this species started invading. That's why it's called invasive. It invades into the space of the other species. So it kills the other species. It does not allow the other species of trees and plants to grow, and it starts spreading like wildfire. And then what has happened is that the natural process, the birds, the animals, or whatever were the other flora and fauna of that region are lost, and you have only these trees which are lying dead. So they are doing no good to that particular, so they are not retaining the soil because their root structure is not supporting the retention of soil. Barish aaya to there is landslide. Then then you have monoculture. Monoculture is basically you only have one type of trees. You don't have multiple type of trees. So the natural process has stopped. The natural process of ecosystem or आपका जो food chain है, that food chain has stopped. So it is no longer a forest. So it was once a forest. It is no longer a forest. So now the authorities have realized this after so many years. And even if you see our forest department, they also do this plantation. They plant teak wood. So it is fast growing, and from there you get teak wood. So after 10 years you will cut it, and you will harness it or harvest it to have teak. So again, looking at plantation from a human centric point of view, not understanding that whether teak is the right species to be planted in that forest. कोई भी forest लो इंडिया में वो teak plant कर देते जाके. So so all these things are doing damage to the forest. So unlike a sacred grove where people don't let anyone intervene into it. And of course also understanding of geology was important. So we keep on seeing these examples of Ellora Ajanta caves and Ellora caves and Lenyadri caves and whatnot, but was it possible to do these things without understanding geology, without understanding the rock strata, without understanding hydrology? It was not possible. So without understanding that what kind of rocks you can actually carve into and to what extent, right? So all this indigenous knowledge was already existing amongst the people, and which has shown its physical manifestation into the natural landforms in the landscape. And of course the knowledge of hydrology, as I said, hydrology and geology are both connected to each other. You have to understand hydrology, geology in conjunction together to understand that where are the sources of water. Because any religious, we may want to call it religious monuments, or you want to call it cultural heritage sites, or whatever you may want to call it. But all of these sites, always understood the importance of forests. They would either be in forests, either be on some sacred sites on top of a mountain, where a sacred side of a mountain would be marked with a temple, or they would be near a water source, okay, where they understood the hydrology and the geology of the site and knew that yes, then in this particular site we will have water, okay, throughout the year if you build a step well or you build a tank, right? This is a very ancient example. So this is in Mauryan age. This is in 325 BC, to 185 BC. So even in those days, with their available technology and their available indigenous knowledge, they could build these rainwater, water harvesting tanks, and could tap into groundwater, right? Geographical location is very important. If any one of you have have been to Hampi, so if you go to Hampi, I mean, even though it is a fact that yes, the Vijayanagar Empire had a very strong, powerful army. Yes, they ruled for 300 plus years, which is longer than the slightly longer than the duration of the Mughal rule in India. They have they were able to fend off each and every attack on their territory by the surrounding Islamic sultanates. But the point is that a major role was played by the geographical siting of that city of Vijayanagar. So if you go to Hampi, to this once which was the Vijayanagar's empire's capital, so you will see that Hampi is surrounded by mountains on all sides with one mountain pass which gives you the entry and exit point to the place. So with the kind of the geological setting of the place, with these huge massive rock boulders, with the kind of the geographical setting sighting, I would say, that you are within surrounded by the mountains on all sides, and the Malaprabha River, which flows through this place. It made it possible for the Vijayanagar Empire and the kings to protect their territory for a very long time from invasions, right? Uh, so they understood the importance of selecting a suitable site, okay, because they existed during a time when the Islamic invasions in India were at its peak, okay, and each and every territory was coming under attack, and during which you had several Islamic sultanates. You had the Gulbarga Sultanate, you have the Bijapur Sultanate, you had the Baridis of Bidar, and you had the Adil Shahis, you had the Golconda, you had the Ahmadnagar Sultanate, and whatnot. So, and you also had the early year of the Mughal forces. So, so at surviving at that point of time, surviving any kind of invasion was possible because of the geographical siting of that particular place. And of course, when the Mughals came, they continued the legacy and took ahead the legacy of water conservation and rainwater harvesting to a next level. So if you go to Mandu, I think this is one of the best examples that we have in our country during the Mughal era, where you get to see rainwater harvesting to its peak. So a huge network of artificial tanks and ponds. I mean, I don't know if you would believe that this water body that you see over here, which looks like a lake, is an artificial lake, and there are two of these. And the structure is called the Jahaj Mahal, and you have both of these artificial tanks which are actually interconnected, through a canal within this building. And it was possible because they understood hydrology. Okay, not only they understood the importance of water, but they also understood means and ways to harvest water, channelize water, and supply it to the city. That is also something they know. So if any of you are wondering that what is this thing over here, this coil kind of a system over here, so this is the most genius way of purifying water. Nowadays we have aquaguard, but they used to create these channels, and this is also from Mandu actually. I think this is in Baz Bahadur's palace on the roof somewhere, if I remember it correctly. So this is a water channel where the water is made to pass through this, and because of this intricate winding path that the water takes, the speed of the water slows down. The speed of flow of water slows down, and this gives enough time for the dust particles, for the suspended particles in the water to settle down, and you get a comparatively more purified form of water exiting on the other side. So intricate network of such channels, long network of such water channels, to purify water. So these indigenous knowledge, somewhere it is lost, somewhere many people are trying to regain that, but all this as to how to treat water, how to manage water, through these systems were also part of the overall landscape idea, apart from, of course, the buildings. And when we come to when we come to the later Mughal period, I mean, the Mughals were also experts in water engineering, okay, hydrological engineering. So they just took all the indigenous knowledge available and used it to their advantage. And also at this point of time, landscapes were designed in a way to represent some sort of a memory of a place which was back in Persia. Okay, because since they came from Persia, they were not indigenous to this land, but they came from Persia and they settled over here. But their gardens would often represent their memories of their place. So the plants, if you see the vegetation, the cypress trees, the chinar trees, especially in Kashmir, where the climate is more conducive to grow chinar trees. Delhi, more or less, some of these cypress trees actually struggle to grow, but they have a lot of palms which they have grown. And some of these trees which they brought in from their place, because they wanted to connect their buildings and associate them to that landscape which they had there in Arabia, in Persia. And also here they understood using water to glorify the presence of their buildings, looking at the building, the reflection of the building in the water, and to glorify the so because basically the Taj Mahal and the Humayun's tomb was all about glorifying the greatness of the emperor even after death. And that thing, to celebrate the architecture or to glorify it, they started using water, their knowledge of how to channelize water through canals and create these artificial ponds and use it to their advantage. And of course, the Taj Mahal, this is something we'll maybe discuss after some time when we look at the Persian or the Islamic era landscapes in India. And the Shalimar Bagh and the Nishad Bagh in Kashmir, where you see the very same influence of a Persian garden, which has been developed. So it is, I mean, people like to call it Mughal gardens because it is Mughals who brought in this concept over here. But if we look at the Persian landscapes, the development of the journey of the Persian landscapes, and we'll understand that these are basically Persian ideas or Persian design that comes over here. And of course, then we have the colonial period where they wanted to do away with everything that was Mughal India, and they did not want to continue that legacy, but instead brought in their European concepts. So if you carefully look at this photograph in the center of the Lutyens Delhi, the Lutyens master plan for Delhi, and then we will be looking at some examples from Italy and France, and then you will be able to correlate as to what I'm talking about. Where gardens would be, for the the administration, okay, the imperial administration, for the Queen or the British imperial administration, and the landscape would often glorify the building, okay, create a setting for weaving the building, or would be designed in a way to so the person is subdued, the person is not important, the imperial rule is important to glorify their existence, one could say, in this country. So, and of course the idea of this bungalow and a private garden attached to a bungalow starts developing in India or comes to India. Even today, if you go to Delhi, and if you take a go to Delhi, that is New Delhi, and you are in this area where you have all the bungalows of the MPs and ministers and MLAs, and you will come across all these bungalows which have these manicured gardens. So the idea of this private garden, most of these during the colonial times were occupied by the British administrative officers and army officers, and that still continues to be today. Our government officials live in these bungalows in Delhi. So the idea of this private garden attached to a house begins during the colonial times in India, at least. Post-independence, the scenario starts changing. We have a more democratic approach towards landscape design. With I think one of the most famous examples one could cite is Corbusier's master plan for Chandigarh, which also, of course, got executed. Keeping aside many criticisms about the same, but you will understand that even though this is a gridiron layout, it has a very strict gridded pattern, but we do see these that he did understand the importance of the green lungs for the city, and starts creating this green belts, which run across and through the city, okay, and provide green spaces for people to rejuvenate for recreation purpose. So at this point of time, the landscape is not only meant for the rich, or not meant only for the merchant class, or it's not meant only for the imperial family, because obviously now it is post-independence, India is a democracy. So it is more about the democratic spaces which are easily accessible and enjoyable by the common man. And of course, these are examples where the ancient heritage, like the Lodhi Park, if you go to the Lodhi Gardens, gets developed to commemorate the cultural heritage of the country. Okay, so whatever is a part of the country, whatever archaeological relics that we have. So these are again spaces where people can access these gardens and enjoy these gardens. And then of course you have the Nehru Park, where and you have the Shakti Sthal. So if I talk about Shakti Sthal in specific, this is, I don't know if how many of you are aware, this is the park which has been dedicated in memory of our ex-Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and where the architect decided to look at the personality of Indira Gandhi as a person and as a leader, and portray that through his design. You know, so they interestingly made use of geological features, that is rock features, okay, and collecting rocks from all across the country, signifying the unity of the country, because Indira Gandhi believed in the unity of the country. This all Indians as one, and all parts of India is integral to the existence of the country. So, getting those pieces of rocks from all across the country, and getting a specifically one piece of rock boulder from Orissa, which the architect felt that character symbolizes the character or the personality of the Prime Minister. Okay, so I mean, of course, you could, I mean, this, I mean, will not be able to discuss all the points, but you can definitely read up about this particular project. There's a beautiful description given by the architect himself. You can easily Google it, and you can see that what was the idea employed, because along with the idea that so he's trying to connect the personality of the person for whom the memorial has been built. This memorial park has been built, and at the same time also thinking about the people, that how do people access this place, how do people use this place. I mean, this is not only meant to be some symbolic park, which you are going to look at it from from a distance from the road, but it is also something that people are going to access, right, and also use it, right. So architecture landscape design becoming more and more democratic and accessible for the people. And of course the current day examples, then we developed as, now we are categorizing into institutional landscapes and public building landscapes for public buildings, or commercial complexes and residential complexes and whatnot. So of course these are the current day examples for that. If we just go back a little bit and understand what is happening in the Western world, because many a times we talk about Italian landscapes and French landscapes. So what was happening in those places? So we see the landscapes of Renaissance period in Italy. Okay, and I'm not going to discuss very much in-depth detail about each and every garden or each and every example, but I will give you the key points as to what was the overall character of, or what was the overall thought behind developing this kind of a landscape, and why it was done. Okay, and what would be the typical features of the same, right? So if you see during the Renaissance, I mean, again, I think in third semester, we had discussed what was the Renaissance movement exactly, what happened at that point of time. So you know that after the medieval ages, or if you want to call it the dark ages, where church had gained much of the control over the society, and the church became the only important body, that is after the Roman empire split into two parts, where the early Christianity, then if you remember, we discussed Romanesque and Gothic. So after all these things, and after you had the Black Plague, basically after which Renaissance as a movement starts in Europe. So people started looking back to the classical examples of the Greek and the Roman civilizations, right? So the monotheistic culture, they believe that that this excessive control of the church on state affairs is not good, and they decided to go back to the look back at the classical examples, and that is where Brunelleschi and these guys come into the picture, and then there's a revival of classical forms and revival of classical architecture. Now, this was also a time when you have the growth of the merchant class. Okay, so the merchant class is the rich class who has a lot of control. So the control is now shifted from the church to the wealthy class of people. So the merchants have control over a lot of control over the society, and they have these private estates, large private estates, huge private estates. So we're looking at one particular example, that is Villa Lante in Badania, and you will see that the idea about landscape at this point of time, you know, has shifted from understanding that humans are a part of nature to this understanding has gone to a point that man started thinking that nature belongs to us, right? And now we are going to shape nature the way we want to, or the way we uh, see it fit. Okay, so the use of axis. So you will see that the way this particular garden sits over here. So there are these two houses basically. Okay, and this is the this basically is the estate. This whole part is the estate. Actually, it spreads. So if you see the houses here and the estate actually spreads right here. Okay, all this area over here. So you see this very strong axis, the axis of the city, which continues and into the garden space and continues beyond into the hills. Okay, and you will see that a lot of imposition of a geometrical you know form on the land, irrespective of what the land contour is, because this is a hilly site and this is at the foothills of that hill. Okay, but irrespective of that, whatever may be the natural contours or whatever may be the natural typology of the land or the topography of the land over here, so this is what we want, you know. So that we want a space, we want a landscape which is going to be in order. So we're going to discipline nature in a certain manner and create a landscape, and we're going to discipline the trees around, we're going to discipline the flower beds around, we're going to discipline the land around, right? And then create this. But at the same time, they also made use of their knowledge about water systems, and this is something which is interesting about the Italians, at least during the Renaissance period, that they understood that how the flow of water, or they understood the natural landform contours and how to engineer the land, right? So all the examples that you see wherever we have the topography of the land which has a sloping side, they were very good in engineering the land, and this was also picked up by the Mughals. As further they go on, they pick this up from Persia, and then they uh, you carried it to the rest of the world. So understanding that the flow of water, from the top of the mountain to the foothills of the mountain, and using that in their design. But at the same time, disciplining nature, having these topiaries. A topiary is basically, you would call, I don't know if you have seen this. If you go to any of these gardens, sometimes you see like hathi ka shape ka kuch aisa hedges must have been cut in the shape of an animal or in the shape of some earth or shape of a human being or something. That's called topiary. That's the art of cutting, pruning the hedge in a certain fashion to create certain forms. So such flower beds, such hedges which are neatly trimmed, and geometrical pattern of hedges, and complementing this centrality of the formal character of the landscape. Because they, at this point of time, man believed in disciplining nature. Okay, so this is the basic fundamental, that is basic idea that is happening at this point of time, along with the understanding of engineering water. How to use the slope of the land to your advantage, and how to channelize water, and how to create fountains, use that natural gravitational pressure to create fountains. So whenever you think of creating fountains nowadays, we see, okay, fountain लगा दो, वो वहाँ पे एक 10 HP का पंप लगा दो, वहाँ पे एक 20 HP का पंप लगा दो, and we will have fountain. But this was not an option for them, right? So they relied on the natural gravitational force of water, and how they could engineer it to create fountains and to create an effect on their site. This was possible because of the natural setting of the site, the natural topographical setting of the site, for which they had to understand that what is the landscape setting of the place, the natural setting of the place. Right? Without which this was not possible, or without which there would be no water. Right? So tapping into the groundwater source. Okay, and this is another example. This is Villa d'Este in Tivoli, in Italy. Again, the same concept, right? So although it is again a formal garden, where the building, the purpose of the garden is to view the building. okay, of the merchant family, of the rich business class family. So this is a garden which is for their own private use. So garden at this point of time, even during the Renaissance, was owned by the rich and the wealthy. So it was not something which was meant for the common people. I mean, today this is a tourist destination, of course, but this was not designed for the common man. Okay, so this was designed as a means to express their hold on the society, or express their position in the society. Okay, now if you look at France in the Baroque period, okay, so they were not very different from what was happening in Italy. Okay, but at the same time, when Italy, when people in Italy were a little more, advanced in terms of, let's say, engineering with water and, at this in France, what you had were an absolute flat, like a formal landscape, which is almost like a carpet which is laid on the face of the earth, right? So you can see what is happening to this forest all around you, right? And then, with no regards to whatever is there in the surrounds, we have something which is, suddenly like a spaceship which lands, and it's just there. So it just creating this central axis to highlight the importance of the mansion, if you may want to call it, instead of calling it a house, right? And this was also there was also a reason about, so you will see that there are no trees, there are no plantations. So if you just see, this is absolutely, I don't know if you want to call it barren. And then so this was also done in order to have clear views of the site. So you start looking at your site from an elevated portion. So if you see these photographs being taken at an elevated portion, because on ground you see nothing, right? Because there are no trees, there are no vertical surfaces. It's just miles and miles of, I think you can almost see the trees of the forests in the background, and then the horizon. That's it, right? So these gardens were made in a way that you can, view these gardens from the window of your mansion or from the balcony of your mansion, right? Also, because the climate is such that even if you want to enjoy the garden, once you want to be there, okay, uh, so these are places with cold climates. So the summers are enjoyable. Summers are like around 20, 25 degrees Celsius. So it is a very conducive situation to be outside. It is not very hot, it is not very cold, and you can still enjoy the outdoors. But these gardens were not conceived to enjoy the outdoors. They were not designed to enjoy the outdoors, because they were not looking at the experiential quality of the space. Because this was also, belonged to the private mansion. This was not for the common man to use it, right? And if you see the previous example, like when we are talking about the spaces in Italy, so these were still gardens where one would engage with certain experiences, or at least some of their senses: sound, visual, feel. So you can feel the water, you can see it, you can hear the sound of the waterfall, right? But over here, what it seems to be like it needs to be a picture perfect. If you take a photograph standing at one point, and yeah, this is the garden. So it is more of something which is for presentation rather than for experiencing, right? Again, this is Palace of Versailles. You will see the amount of, and can you start making some connections of this to the Latins master plan of Delhi that we saw, right? I think so. I mean, of course, this is not the direct precedent, or not the precedent for the Latins plan. It is the Macmillan plan, which we'll be discussing in the next coming session. But we do find these similarities. So this idea of this geometrical, formal disciplining of nature, okay, controlling the landscape, controlling the landform, no matter what the landform is around you. Okay? This starts at this particular point of time, or this happens at this in this particular era. So you can see that the one of the main avenues of the city comes and it continues, and then there are these cross avenues which happen at different places, right, to give this a formal character. Yeah. So these are not places meant to be experienced. I mean, you just imagine being here and just been lost, you know. So there's nothing to look at. I mean, if I stand here, all I see is the horizon. That's it. I mean, my visual experience at the most is going to be directed because of these row of trees, and after that, I'm completely lost, right? So these were not spaces which were meant for, enjoying the space on ground, but these were more of spaces or landscape which was designed to enjoy from a height or from a particular view. So if you look at the kind of topiary or the kind of this is not a natural form. Look at the human figure and look at this height of this. So this is not the natural form of the trees, isn't it? This is not the natural form of the trees. This is what topiary is about. Creating these, I don't know, some weirdo shapes out of plantations, right? So even the natural trees, as if there is an attempt to hide these natural trees by creating this green wall. So everything over here is sort of artificial, you could say, one could say. And of course, using sculpture. So the more the idea is, that you look at the building. Okay, so you are directing your vision towards the building by creating these row of trees, and you look at this in the foreground of this sculpture and a water body. So you could just duplicate this and this reflection on the water, right? So everything is about this, seeing this. It's not about experiencing the landscape. So all of these gimmicks, whatever has been done over here, is done to see this. So this is not important. This is the only thing that matters for them, right? So the landscape over here only wants to complement this building. It is not about the experiential quality or experiential aspect of what the user is going to go through or what experience the user is going to have. So that was never the point of designing these landscapes. And when we come to England, I'll just take this part and then we'll call it a day maybe. And when we come to England, they had a very, the English had a very different way of looking at landscapes. They did not subscribe to this idea of, glorifying something, like, exposing all of it at one point of time, and they like to play hide and seek. And England has this advantage in terms of what we call as the rolling plains. Okay, so if you visit England, and if you take a drive, if you drive a couple of hours from north to south, you will see that miles after miles, what you see are plains. Okay, so they don't have these plains, and you will have these these plains for miles together. You will have those, and you will not see some mountains, like suddenly one huge mountain like us. Nothing. You just, for miles together, they have these green meadows and plains, right? And some bunch of trees, okay, at some distance. So what the English did is they developed something called the picturesque landscape, and they started treating the whole setting as an experience. So they wanted the user to take a walk through the park, okay, take a walk through the woods, and then start experiencing landscape and start experiencing or discovering certain things as they walk. Okay, so you take a walk along the park, okay, and suddenly you discover a tower, suddenly you discover a bridge, suddenly you come across a house, suddenly you come across a mansion, right? And it is more about experiencing by walking through the park amidst the trees. So either in some places maybe you are walking amidst the trees, some places you are walking in a meadow, some suddenly you discover a bridge and then water body and you cross over it. So what they did was the designers at this point of time, they started bringing in certain elements into the site. So diverting river and getting the water in. So how will you get this amount of water inside? So they would just go wherever the river is flowing. So you would just divert a part of the river and get it in your site and join it back to the river. And this is probably your site over here. So you make the water flow through your site, right? And you create your landscape in such a way that you have this play of hide and seek, and suddenly discovering something, suddenly hiding something. So you always get a view of a distant object, a distant thing. Okay, you always get a view of something far away, okay, through your landscape. So like a picturesque landscape, it's like a photograph, that you're taking. And suddenly, as you're walking, you suddenly discover that there is a structure nestled amongst the trees, and there is a meadow in the front, and then so creating a scenery. So they are more concerned about creating a scenery. So although it is somewhere about the experience, but it is more of a visual experience. Okay, so looking at something, right? And the method is also the same, that wherever, and having seamless visual connections across the site. So how do you achieve that? For example, there are some animals, and this is your site boundary. So so there is a scenario. So maybe this is your site, but this is the outside, and you want to take advantage of the view of the outside, and you don't want to create a fence. So they created something called the haha fence. Now this is called the haha fence, because what they did is, if this is my land, what you would do is you will create a boundary wall, but this would block your vision, right? So what they did is they created a trench, so I can still see the outside instead of creating this fence or a boundary wall. So the idea of borrowed views comes into the picture. So you're borrowing this view, which is not part of your site. Your site is here, but you're borrowing this view by doing this, and so that the animals cannot come to your site. They come over here and they get stuck and they go back. So we're creating a trench. So that is called the haha fence. Okay, literally like somebody laughing, haha. Okay, like somebody made a fool out of someone, perhaps. I don't know why this haha comes into existence, but it's called the haha fence. And this is what it does. It helps you to take in the borrowed views of the landscape, because always understand that whatever you have within your site is, of course, you have it with you, but whatever you have beyond your site. So if you're seeing a mountain beyond your site, if you can see a river from your site, if you can see the sea from your site, then that is something which you are borrowing it, and you can take advantage of that, at least in terms of visual connection. So that idea comes into existence over here. And if you see in this middle this thing, you will see that what the designers are doing is they are creating these drawings, and like picture frames, that okay, this is what the landscape looks like right now, and this is what it will look like after the planting. So you may get a feeling that this is a natural setting. Okay, these trees were existing, or they were the way it is. No, it were not. So they were the asymmetrical, or you can say the natural or the near natural way in which the trees or the plants have been planted, okay, or the way the meadows have been treated, is also something which was meticulously designed. Okay, so what is existing, and you just take off that cover and say that okay, now this is what has been proposed. Okay, so they also used to make massive changes in the natural setting, right? And of course, making extensive sketches to understand ki, when you walk over here, what do you see? Probably when you come over here, what do you see? So there is a network of pathways, or the route which you take, and start discovering different things as you walk along the park. So a more complex way of looking at landscape than what the Italians and the French considered as landscape gardens in the early period. But still, at the same point of time, whatever is the natural landscape has been as a heavy intervention, to make it look picturesque, to make it look beautiful, to get these views and vistas of the site, okay, from a distance, to frame that perfect picture. Okay? So they're still looking at or emphasizing more on the aesthetic quality of the landscape. And what is the time? Okay, maybe another 10 minutes. And what happens in the 19th and 20th century is post-industrialization. Okay, so when industrialization takes place in England, and then of course in different parts of Europe, so this is the time when parks are developed, okay, for the people, because a lot of people started migrating from the rural areas into the urban areas where the industries and factories were set up. The larger land holdings which were there with the merchant class, started disintegrating, okay, into smaller land parcels. The rich merchant class was no longer able to hold on and maintain those large patches of land. Okay, all these couple of examples that we saw in the French and the Italian and the English styles. Of course, again, the English landscapes that we saw are all part of the estates and mansions of the rich merchant class people, the wealthy families. So post-industrialization, what happens is, I mean, there's a lot of people who have during industrialization they have moved into the cities, okay, and the cities are overcrowded. Okay, so at one point of time, you have the major cities like London, which had major epidemics which broke out. Okay, so there was a major health and safety issue because of poor sanitation, uh, non-availability of clean drinking water, and because the cities were not planned to take the amount of the kind of load, the kind of pressure that was put on the cities in terms of migration, in terms of number of people who migrated to the city. So what happened at this point of time is the city administration started thinking that apart from the health infrastructure that needs to be created in terms of hospitals and doctors and nurses is what they need, but they also need to look at the social welfare and social well-being of people, right? So because of this, they decided that you need recreation parks, you need recreational spaces for people. So there was a time till before industrialization that the parks and gardens only belonged to the rich and the wealthy, but now they need a more democratic model, okay, where parks and recreation spaces need to be accessible by the people. Okay? And this is where a new revolution started in designing of parks and gardens, which were meant for the people to access them. Okay, so today what we see in terms of parks, okay, at one point of time, this even started with in America, it started with cemeteries. So one of the most initial parks, which is a very famous example, which is the Auburn Cemetery. Okay, it's Auburne. So the Auburn Cemetery in US, which was one of the initial public park, which was actually a cemetery. So cemetery which was designed as a park because there was dearth or there was scarcity of open space. Okay, and they decided that the only open space that is available is a cemetery where dead people are buried. Why not convert that into a park? Okay, we can have a cemetery in one part of the park, but maybe the rest of the area can be dedicated to a public park, right? And that was the first example. So a cemetery was the first example of a public park in the US. And then this idea obviously spread to other parts of the US in other cities and also in England. So this example that we're looking at is the Birkenhead Park in England, where you will see that first time a park was deliberately designed. So you will see that you have the settlements or the houses of people, okay, and within the settlement spaces, so whatever space was available was transformed into a public park, which was more democratic in nature, where people could access those parks for recreation purposes, right? And then we have this most famous example from this particular era, which is the Central Park in New York. I think maybe some of you may have visited this place, or if you get a chance to go to this place. So, I mean, this has a very a dark history attached to this particular park. Is the space for this park was obtained by displacing the original inhabitants of this land. So there was a tribal community. In fact, actually, all of Australia, most of America is actually by the Britishers. They have been captured by displacing the originals. So it's the Aboriginals in the Australia, it's the Red Indians in America, where they were displaced, and their houses were forcefully burned down, because they refused to move out of this place. but they wanted to create this park, and they displaced them from that place, and then they created this park. Anyways, uh, because this is a famous example, because this has some important events related to it. So this is developed by Frederick Law Olmsted. Okay, and he is the person who, for the first time, while designing this particular park, he coined the term landscape architect. Before this project, the term landscape architect was not used by anybody. So people were designing gardens. Of course, we saw all these examples of landscape parks associated to mansions and whatnot. But the term landscape architect was first coined by Frederick Law Olmsted, who was working on this particular project. And this is a huge park. You can see the city of New York. Yeah, I think this photograph on the right gives you a fair idea of the. So even at that time, they selected a site which was a perfect rectangle, and whatever happens within that site happens within it. So, and this is the first time where they actually segregated the various modes of movement. So the pedestrian movement being segregated from the horse carriages. So, and elevating one pathway over the other. So now you may be thinking, this is very commonplace. इसमें क्या इतना बड़ा है? So you are thinking, you are able to think that इसमें इतना क्या बड़ी बात है, because somebody did this, at some point of time. Otherwise, because this was a new concept at that point of time, so people had not figured out how to segregate various modes of transport within a park. Because if you understand that for a park of this scale, there is no cross connection. If I have to go here, do I have to go all around here or all around here? So instead of that, there are these cross connections which exist, within this park, which allows you to move from one side to the other, through the park. So that was considered to be one of the ingenious solutions. So the basic point being that in this point of time in Europe and America, the concept of public park develops. That is post-industrialization, where parks are no longer restricted to the rich and the wealthy families, but they become a part of the everyday life of the common man, right? So that is where the idea of public park starts. Today, which looks very commonplace, had to, people at some point of time had to agitate and had to, fight with the government to convince them that we need public parks. Okay, and it is after that the government was convinced, and they started with the cemetery, converting a cemetery into a public park, and then of course creating these parks. So. Of course, I'm not because I'll be sharing a drive folder, a Google Drive folder with all of you, which has many books, ebooks, of course, of books on ebooks on landscape design, landscape architecture, various aspects of landscape architecture. So that also has this book on the illustrated history of landscape architecture, and that book talks about all these eras and many more examples. Of course, we have limited time to discuss all these in detail, so I have only picked up a few examples, but it has all those examples which you can go in detail. Of course, that drive folder will also have many other books pertaining to the topics that we will be discussing in the coming sessions. That is also there. And yeah, so but I will be sharing that drive folder with you a little later. So once we go through these topics one by one, we discuss them. After that, we'll do that. I'll share that link with you, which will help you in your assignments also, because we'll be giving you certain assignments based on the topics that we discuss. Right? I know we have gone 17 minutes beyond what we are supposed to. But if any one of you have any questions, you can ask anything you want to ask, or if Shefali, Sampada, Weber, if you want to add something to it, you may please. Is everybody here or people are gone? I mean, what? Yeah.
Sir,
Yeah.
most of the people are leaving now, I think so.
They are leaving. Haha, yeah, you can leave. I mean, I wanted to ask if anybody wants to ask anything. Otherwise, we are done. We can call it.
Anyone has any questions?
No,
नहीं
ma'am.
नहीं है तो no बोल दो. हाँ, very good.
No.
Okay. Okay.
No, sir.
Fine. So,
No, sir.
right. Just a moment. Yapali ma'am, regarding the attendance, you have taken this attendance?
Yes, sir, attendance is done.
Okay, just a moment. I think.
Okay, nothing from my side as well.
Sampada madam, yeah, बोलिए. Yeah.
Any nothing from my side as well. So let's call it a day.
Okay. Yeah. Fine. Okay. Then yeah. Bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye,
sir.
sir. Bye, sir. Thank you, sir.